Hello and welcome to a strange interstitial episode of Avo Sahavo. What I've been thinking recently, and through my experience of reading so many books this year, is that some books are difficult for various reasons, right? And what's been nice going through a lot of classics is rediscovering things that I tried to read when I was younger and I just completely failed, but being more aware of why I felt that way. So, what makes individual books difficult, and how can people get better at reading more difficult books? I've really had to look at my own biases because being a student of English and then later a teacher of English, I've really needed to think about how can I get students to actually read books, right? And I can't just blame students and say that they don't want to or they don't enjoy reading. It's more so the book itself. Sometimes the book is difficult, it's hard to get into, and something that might be easy for me to read could be really difficult for someone else to read. And so I wanted to think more deeply about literary difficulty, right? If I was to look at a classic work of literature, is it difficult, and what makes it difficult, and what kinds of barriers exist for people to read these books? And are there any methods for individuals to get better at doing this? Because I could definitely feel my own reading ability getting better as I practice more and more of each of these. So I've gone away over my head and I've made a spreadsheet, and hopefully this can help me articulate all the things that I've been thinking about. And this is what it looks like. So the way that I've set it up is all of the books that I've read this year that I felt have been challenging or had a little bit of bite to it, I've broken them down into a few categories that I've felt make them difficult, and I've averaged those out so that there's a bunch of fancy Excel formulas in here that gives each book a score, and the higher the score, the more difficult the book. And I'll explain what each of these categories does. Hopefully each one makes some sense. I don't know what I'm doing here. Everything is broken down into a few specific components that makes a book difficult, and first one's length. And this one is the most obvious one. If a book looks really big, then of course it's going to be more challenging. I often have this problem where if I try to read a long book, I will get midway into it, I would be motivated at the beginning, and then midway I might fall into a bit of a slump. I'd get tired of it, I want to read something else, and a few days and weeks and months pass and I forget entirely about what happens in the book, right? So that's length. I find the longer the book is, the harder it is to stay focused, and the more chance I have to give it up and have to come back later in the future. Next is vocabulary. This one I have no idea how to actually teach because English is a bad language, but depending on how difficult the words of a book are, that can obviously make it more difficult. If you're reading a sentence where half the words are things that you've never seen before, it forces you to either go look things up in a dictionary or just push forward not really understanding what happened in that sentence. And either way, that prevents the book from actually communicating what you want to get out of it. Next is syntax. This has to do with not the words themselves, but the way that they're arranged. So a simple syntax is a sentence that just glides very smoothly, right? It doesn't really distract you. And it goes all the way up past Victorian and into hostile, where we get a book whose grammar really doesn't want you to understand it. It reminds me of this passage from Silas Marner I was reading earlier this year. This was one of the books that actually made me want to make this scale because nothing about it was that difficult. It's quite small, the plot is very simple, but you get a sentence like this. This is the first sentence of chapter 2. Even people whose lives have been made various by learning sometimes find it hard to keep a fast hold on the habitual views of life, on their faith in the visible, nay, on the sense that their past joys and sorrows are a real experience, when they are suddenly transported to a new land, when the beings around them know nothing of their history and share none of their ideas, where their mother earth shows another lap, and human life has other forms than those on which their souls have been nourished. Full stop. That sentence is like 100 words, it's so long, and after you get to the end of the sentence, just go, what was the point of that, right? Because the syntax of it is just so unusual that it doesn't enter your brain in the way that it should. So syntax, definitely very difficult. Next one is about thematic depth. This one to me is when the things a book are about tend to be quite difficult or high-minded. If you don't know particular philosophical theories or different ways of looking at the world, then a book sometimes can be quite unkind in not making sense unless you also vibe with that particular philosophy. I have symbology, so how much of the book is meant to be understood as metaphor or as symbol? Can we take the story literally, or do you need to be able to interpret more metaphorical parts of the narrative in order to understand what the author's trying to do? I have cognitive load. This one is how much concentration do you need to have to actually read the book properly. This is kind of like a combination of all the other categories, but sometimes a book can just be very, very demanding and require you to be thinking closely about the entirety of it as you read, whereas other books, they can get so easy that you can multitask while doing it, right? I have this terrible, terrible habit where sometimes on the way to work, well, I read on the train, but after I get off the train, I walk a few steps to my workplace and I'll be reading as I walk, and that's quite dangerous. But if I can do it safely, that means the book probably isn't taking up too much of my mental load. And if a book is more cognitively demanding, like I'll need to be awake, I'll need to be alert, I like to have a notebook ready, that's makes things harder. Next, character web. If the amount of characters is very high and the way that they're connected to each other is very complex, this often forces me to either have a list of characters at the start or to make my own tree or notebook, and that makes things much more difficult. The narrative arc too. Is the storyline very simple? Is it like one thing happens, leads to another, or is it quite difficult to understand how each of the plot elements are fitting together? Pacing has to do with how quickly the plot moves, because I find that when we read, we want to be pushed forward by some kind of event, right? We want to know what happens next. And there are books which prevent that. There are books that have chapters and chapters of just background information, and it can be hard to stay motivated to read if all you're doing is reading details that don't push the plot forward. I have chronology. This is how the book is sequenced. So is it in linear chronology? Is it kind of easy to understand? Or is it constantly jumping backwards and forwards in time to the point where, again, you need to go to a notebook and you need to sequence when the events happen in which relation to other events? I have intertextuality. How many other books do you need to have read to understand this one? Are there references to Shakespeare, to other classic literary works, and is the book meaningless without prior knowledge of these references? And lastly, I have modern relevance. Does the book still mean something to us today? Because sometimes if a book is written in the 1600s, it's written for audiences in the 1600s, and the themes are just not going to have any correspondence to what we see today, right? It also becomes more difficult because the values are so distant. The kinds of beliefs and attitudes that get expressed in the fiction might be completely opposite to what we have today. And so it's hard to push through the book as well because you disagree with some of the values that the author is trying to present. So across all of these categories, I would give each book a score out of 10, and then that gets eventually averaged out into an overall index that helps me decide if this book is more difficult than another one. So now what I thought I'd do is I would recommend some books that have helped me get better in each of these categories. I realized that often when you're trying to read a difficult work, it's difficult for a lot of different reasons, and maybe you are someone who has trouble with one of these categories but not another, right? And what I found to be very useful continuing to read this year has been to read works that are difficult just for one reason, but all the other stuff is quite easy. And a few of these books are things that I would give as examples of those. So, first of all, for length, I would recommend Watership Down. This is a long, long book, but everything else about it is very easy. It's classified as a children's book, but I'm very surprised if any children would enjoy it, because it is a very dark and sad book. It's about a group of rabbits that decide to leave their home and try to find a safer place to live across the English countryside. And it's this big, long journey with lots of characters, but it's always very pacey, very kinetic. The language is easy, and you're always interested in the next plot event. The only thing that holds it back is its length, right? So if you're trying to get better at reading something that's a bit longer, this one is my recommendation. For syntax, if you're not used to long, complex Victorian sentence structure, The one that I would absolutely have to go with is Pride and Prejudice, just because everyone knows the story already, so you don't have to worry about the narrative as much whilst you're reading. You can just kind of focus on what each sentence is saying and what the author is trying to do. This is one of those instances where I would actually recommend watching the movie before reading the book, because you don't read this for the story, right? You read this for the actual phrasing of these characters, the way the language brings it to life. I think that getting used to the syntax by reading something like early Jane Austen, it will help you when you're then trying to move towards Victorian literature that is a bit more difficult and involved. For thematic depth and symbology, I have The Outsider by Albert Camus. This is a really simple book, a very short book. I could finish this in probably an afternoon. And the narrative is really straightforward, right? The narrative is just one main event and the consequences of it. But what's interesting about this is it can be read in the lens of the philosophy of existentialism. It can also be read as a larger symbol for various colonial forces, masculinity. Lots of different themes occur in this as well. And so if you want a simple book that you can interpret in lots of different ways and consider how symbolism and metaphor can create meaning by giving a much looser representation of something complex like philosophy, this is the one that I would suggest. For narrative arc and chronology, I would go with Slaughterhouse-Five. This one's interesting because this one jumps everywhere in time, but it's quite easy to follow still. It's the story of the Second World War and the bombing of Dresden, but in that situation, the protagonist gets shot straight into the future, and they live this alternate existence as, like, I can barely even explain it. It's kind of like a human in an alien zoo, right? And their experiences in the future reverberate into their experiences in the World War II, and also their experiences in the 60s and 70s as a writer and a journalist trying to get down this story. It's wild and very entertaining and very funny, but it does challenge you by forcing you to consider how the story gets pieced together, what parts are true and untrue, and how everything just connects, because it's very non-linear, it's very postmodern. But that's my recommendation, Slaughterhouse-Five. For narrative arc and pacing, I would recommend Breakfast at Tiffany's. I love this book, but also, if you ask me what happens in it, I have no clue. I really could not tell you, because nothing happens in it, right? It's a very nice story with gorgeous sentences and really likable characters, except there's not really any plot events. It's just lounging around, enjoying the company of these people. And so, if you're more used to books that do push you along with a kind of narrative arc, this is a great entry point into just vibing out, reading a book and vibing it out. And for intertextuality, this one is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is retellings of fairy tales, and it's a great place to start for intertextuality because it engages with the original literature and it flips it on its head. It questions things that existed in the original stories, but it's not as if you need to go and read a really difficult story to then get into this, right? These stories can be enjoyed on their own, but what's even better is to actually look at the text of the stories that they're drawing from, things like Charles Perrault and things like the Brothers Grimm, and looking at the original language and comparing that in all its detail to the stories that Angela Carter writes. It's a much more pleasurable experience, and I find that reading the stories from here and comparing them to the originals, that's kind of taught me the value of being aware of more literature and how modern literature can connect and take ideas from classic ones. Alright, and last thing that I wanted to do for this video is I have a few books on my shelf that I know are very difficult, and they are books that I've kind of kept aside, or sometimes very funnily I bought a few years ago because I assumed I was smart, and I tried to read them and I realized no, I am not smart, and I continue to not be smart. And I would like to challenge myself to one of these because I'm doing a little bit better than expected for my reading challenges here. And so I've got some of these on the list right now. All the classics, Ulysses, Middlemarch, Anna Karenina. Dune is there because I tried reading it as a kid and I did not get that. City Sister Silver and The Tree of Man, both books that I thought I was smart enough for and I was not. For the Faulkner duology, which is The Sound of the Fury and Absalom, both prescribed to me at uni. those were books that I read 100 pages of, and then I thought, I have no clue what's happening here. Count of Monte Cristo, Foucault's Pendulum, Moby Dick, just long books. Name of the Rose, The Corrections, Gone with the Wind, David Copperfield, Gravity's Rainbow, Germinal, which I know nothing about, and Vanity Fair. All of them I know to be quite long books, quite old, difficult to read. Some of them more difficult than others, but I also don't know exactly how hard each of these are relative to each other. I just want to challenge myself to something, right? And I might approach these books with more effort than I normally would. I'd probably get a little notebook and keep track of all the names and all the key ideas, just so that I can try my best to understand it and see if there's any value in it, because I've tried before and I've failed. Like, I know these are hard books, and not that I can brag or have any like real sense of achievement. It's just so that I can see what the deal is about, right? See why everyone ranks them so highly. Anyways, I'm only going to read one, and I figured I'd use this wheel to pick which one I would read in December. I'm just going to spin it once. There are some that I really want and some that I really don't want, but I'm just going to commit myself to what this wheel is going to say. Oh, I really don't want that. Oh, it's Foucault's Pendulum. So, this is an odd one. This is an odd one. So, Foucault's Pendulum is a birthday gift from a friend in high school. And this edition was from 2012. And I remember because inside there was a little note that said, "Happy birthday, I think this is something that you'd be into." And I was a very pretentious teenager at the time. I was reading my Derrida, I was deconstructing things, thinking I was smart, well, not really being smart. And this, I have no idea what it's about. I thought it was interesting. The cover is really weird. It's like some kind of Renaissance torture scene. And I have no clue. I really don't know. It is 635 pages long. And I've been told that Umberto Eco's style is very dense and very difficult. He's much more famous for The Name of the Rose, which I also have on my shelf. But this one, look, I'll give it a try. The wheel says what it says. Oh gosh, I just flipped past and there's a page that's literally just... What is this? What am I looking at? Well, I guess I'll figure it out. Okay, so what's the first line? First, there's like symbols. What is going on in this book? There's two epigraphs. First is from Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim. "Only for you, children of doctrine and learning, have we written this work. Examine this book, ponder the meaning we have dispersed in various places and gathered again. What we have concealed in one place we have disclosed in another, that it may be understood by your wisdom." And then another quote by Raymond Smolyan, "Superstition brings bad luck." In the first line, I don't know what language this is. What language is this? Is it Arabic? I don't know. Am I supposed to understand this? The first line is, "This was when I saw the pendulum. Pendulum's capitalized." Oh gosh, what have I got myself into? Okay, so we'll see. Maybe updates. I don't know. I have no clue. I hope I can finish this. It looks hard. It looks really hard. Look, there's like symbols and circles. What is... okay. Well, wish me luck. Goodbye.